Good afternoon. My name is Joan Steele, and I'm chair of NACD Chicago chapter. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's program, The Role of Boards in Societal Issues. The relevant questions the boards are tackling today may no longer be whether or why to engage, but rather which and how. Our distinguished speakers address the complex questions corporate leaders and boards must consider and the business case for engagement. Before turning to our program, I'd like to acknowledge chapter sponsors Charles River Associates and Sidley and Austin, who collaborated on this program. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to the NACD members joining us from the Colorado chapter and other chapters. With nearly 250 members and their guests registered today, this is the largest audience ever to attend a Chicago chapter event, and we are really thrilled. The program is scheduled to end at 4:45. While Ken Chenault has a hard stop at that time, Christie Hefner and Andrea Hagelgans have agreed to stay until 5 o'clock, a special bonus, to take additional questions. Lastly, please view this program in speaker mode and use the chat box for questions. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Christie Hefner, who is personally responsible for bringing our outstanding speakers to our program today, Ken and Andrea. Christie is the longest serving female CEO of a New York Stock Exchange company, and she sits on several public and private company boards. I will now turn to Christie to guide us through today's important discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joan. And welcome to everybody. So as the recent NACD article, CEO Activism, What's the Board's Role, noted, CEO activism is now a fact of life. And it's different from engaging lobbyists or even political contributions. It's different from traditional corporate social responsibility. And as the term activist suggests, this new activity is by definition controversial. We're very fortunate to have with us today two extraordinarily experienced and thoughtful individuals to discuss this topic. Ken is the chairman and managing director of the venture capital firm General Catalyst. While there, he invests in high growth companies and provides guidance to them. Ken also is a board member of Airbnb, Berkshire Hathaway, Chief, and the Harvard Corporation. And he was formerly the chairman and CEO of American Express for 17 years, as well as having served on a number of other corporate boards, including Facebook, IBM, and Procter & Gamble, as well as on the executive committee of the Business Roundtable. Andrea is the lead managing director at Edelman, where she oversees social issues engagement, working with clients to help them understand and manage both the risks of inaction and the risks of action. She's also experienced in the public sector, where she was the highest ranking communications professional in Mayor de Blasio's administration. And their full biographies are in our chat. So let's begin. I'm going to start by saying that the pressures on CEOs and companies to take public positions that they would have considered way outside their purview only a few years ago is increasingly bringing boards into realms of controversy. And that's simply the fact. So as we talk about it today, I want to reference a recent Harvard Law School forum on corporate governance that framed the question as having three options for companies and their boards going forward. Number one, corporate America chooses to mirror the political landscape, choosing to be red, blue, or battleground centrist, and expecting that its employees, its customers, its investors will align with those they choose. Number two, classical Milton Friedman, companies refuse to take any positions. Or number three, companies respond to the current realities, but they do so in a way that is grounded in the basics of fiduciary duty. So let's get a baseline of our audience. So if we could put up the first question and let us hear from you as to where your boards are today. And while you're voting, I'm going to ask Andrea to sort of set the table for us from her experience. The Edelman Trust Barometer, which many of you are familiar with, has for 23 years been measuring business reputations and what influences them. So Andrea, can you help our audience understand what the dynamic is today and how it may be different than it was some years ago?
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here speaking with you about this very timely topic. As you mentioned, the Edelman Trust Barometer has been released for the last 23 years. And each year we look at a real theme that emerges, and it's a global study, but we also have market cuts as well as industry cuts. And this year, the theme that really emerged is the causes and consequences of navigating a polarized world, and what can business do about it. And what is abundantly clear is that there are increased expectations from multiple stakeholders for business to engage in issues. So for example, whether it's your employees, which is where we're seeing a lot of these topics arise, or it's your consumers, and particularly thinking about your Gen Z consumers, or those younger millennials as well, there is an expectation that you are, as a company leader, knowing, understanding the societal issues landscape, and this idea that these issues are not the purview of business is not accepted. And the reality is, what we see is it benefits the bottom line when you have awareness of these issues. So for example, in the US, what we found is that 65% say they would buy or advocate for brands based on beliefs and values, and that 72% say having a societal impact is a strong expectation or deal breaker when considering a job. So this is about your bottom line today, but also your future in terms of the talent that you're hoping to attract and retain at your company.
Let's put the responses up. And it's been said, to your point about employees, Andrea, that we should add an E to ESG, and the E should be for employees. So an interesting point. All right, so what we're hearing from our audience is 45% agree that companies should speak out, but a full 25% say no, and almost a third are not sure. And I don't think that that's surprising. This is uncharted territory, and I think that where you are right now as a company is mirrored in the society writ large. So maybe we can dig into how to think about whether and when and how. And maybe, Ken, I can turn to you and just say, from your extensive experience, how do you think boards need to decide whether to speak out on any particular issue?
I think what's important is I go back to the mission of the company and the values of the company. And I do think that there is a philosophical decision that companies need to make. And when I began my tenure as CEO, I said to the board, I have a firm belief that corporations exist because society allows us to exist. And we have a responsibility to function in that society. But I tied it to the fact that I wanted American Express to be an enduring company. And to be an enduring company, we had to continue to evolve and change with the times, but be very clear about what our core values are as a company. So I think that what CEOs and boards face is a tension between becoming a more inclusive company. So let's just say the reality is that we are now employing a workforce that is far more representative of our society than certainly was the case 100 years ago. And if you take the position that you want to have a company that is welcoming to all employees, that means there are certain issues that you will need to speak out on. Now, Christie, as you and I have talked about this for years, and you know that I have a strong view that I don't think CEOs should speak out on every single issue. But there are some core issues that are important. And let me just give you an historical example from IBM during the days of Tom Watson is in the law of the land, it was separate but equal. Blacks were separated from whites. Tom Watson declared in the workplace at IBM, they in fact would not accept the law of the land, separate but equal. That to me was very courageous, but it was very consistent with Watson's view that IBM needed to be open to all Americans. And so I think it is foolhardy to take a position that you will never comment on social issues because you now have different types of employees in your company that you can't ignore. And you also have customers that are broadly representative. But I think you've got to ground your choice, and I'll give you one recent example. Ken Frazier, the former CEO of Merck, and I led and encouraged companies to take a position on voting rights legislation. The reason why we took that position was not a partisan position, but we thought it went to the core of our democracy. And we got hundreds of CEOs to take a position, not for Republicans or Democrats, but because they said this is core to our democracy. So to me, I think a board has to, one of the things a board has to do is help the CEO in his or her judgment on different issues. And I think if there is pressure to speak out, my view is you don't always want to be in a situation where you're just responding.
Right.
And in certain situations, you should take a leadership position, but it has to be incorporated in the mission and the values and be representative of your employees and your stakeholders.
So I think that's a super important point, which is this concept that there needs to be an alignment with the strategy, the values, the mission of the company. So, and as we would say about almost anything that would rise to the level of the board, better not to be addressing it in the moment, but to have thought it through in
That's right.
advance. So maybe, Andrea, building on this, can you talk a little bit about kind of the process here? So a board is starting to grapple with this with their CEO. How should they think about assessing who their stakeholders are, where the issues are they should actually engage, and what the responses should be? Talk us through a little bit of kind of the inside of how you work with clients on these issues.
Absolutely. And I completely agree with what Ken was saying here. I don't want anyone to walk away and think from our data we're saying go out and speak on everything. It absolutely has to align with the mission and the values of the company. But that doesn't mean it's also so narrow that you don't understand the stakeholder view within a company. So I'll use as an example, last year when Politico published the leaked decision that would ultimately become the decision to overturn Roe versus Wade. 2 days prior, I had been talking to a number of companies asking what their plans were should in fact this decision come out. And pretty much to a T, I was told this is not an issue that our people will care about. This is not a business issue. Within 24 hours of that leaked decision, I can tell you I was on multiple phone calls where they were scrambling to figure it out.
Absolutely.
And that is because to their employees, this was a healthcare issue. This was covered in a number of insurance policies. This affected their senior leadership, particularly women were very vocal about this. And so, the idea that you know exactly what issue is going to be the one that is relevant to your stakeholders is, it's not feasible unless you're actually talking to those stakeholders. So the way in which boards can really be supportive and helpful here is making sure that the company has a process for engaging a diverse array of stakeholders in this, using the ERGs that may exist within a company to that advantage, remembering to bring together all the disparate voices, whether that's communications and marketing, general counsel's office, CHRO, all of those players are really, really important so that it is not a siloed response that is occurring. Because the reality is people surprise you all the time about what they see as relevant to the company as well. It also means doing some real due diligence around the impact of the issue on the business, understanding the risk. And again, that's risk on both sides. As Ken was saying, there's real opportunity to be made here if you want to be a first mover company in some of these spaces. Understanding where your positions have been previously. If you've gone out on Women's History Month and championed gender equality, but yet you have terrible pay and equity issues that are very well known, you should expect to be called out on that by at least your employees, if not others. And then really, again, back to that idea of understanding the expectations of key stakeholders. I'll just add one last thing. I think this idea of speaking out is too narrow. There's a whole continuum of communications that happens. And in that Dobbs example, the majority of companies did not, go out publicly. They did not tweet. It wasn't a marketing campaign, but they were in communication with their employees and very transparent about their decision-making process.
And they may have responded in terms of policies, travel or other kinds of policies.
Exactly. So this idea about speaking out, you're seeing this in the ESG space as well. Companies understand that they have to think about the full array, not just the marketing campaign.
Yeah, I think, Andrea, it's such an important point. Understanding your different stakeholders, going through the risk assessment. And I do know that there were some companies, they knew obviously that the Supreme Court was going to rule. Mm-hmm. And some CEOs started talking to their boards. Mm-hmm. And I know in a number of cases, as people thought about how to deal with this issue, one was to say, we've got to reassert what the healthcare benefits are, because we had made a commitment and we're going to have to live up to that commitment. And that's something we're going to talk about to our employees. We're going to be prepared to talk about it publicly. So there are different levels that you can take here. And frankly, as we all know, for CEOs, you don't know everything that's coming down the pike. But that issue you knew was coming down the pike. I'll give you another issue that's coming down the pike. I can't talk about it that much because I'm on the Harvard Corporation, but that is the affirmative action case.
Affirmative action case. Yeah.
And my view is that CEOs better be talking to their board because people are going to ask, what will it mean for diversity?
Yeah.
Is a CEO going to say, I just need to reassert that our company is committed to diversity? Here are the reasons why. And that's an issue that, frankly, if a CEO and a board acts surprised and is not prepared, I would say the fault is on the CEO and the board. Yeah, because that's an issue
let's take a look at where our audience is on this very point. Let's put up that second question, because I'm curious as to, what's the baseline of our companies represented here. So, and while we're voting on that, I want to drill down on this point you made, Ken and Andrea, about the CEO. So do you feel that, one of the things boards should be doing is potentially charging their CEOs, in effect, with the responsibility to do some of this due diligence work of prioritizing their stakeholders, helping to evaluate risks and responses, and then bringing that into the boardroom? Is that part of the role of the board here?
I agree. I mean, the reality is, Christie, most large companies have public policy groups, and also the business leaders have to be aware of these issues. And just as they do on core business issues, they should say, here are some potential scenarios. Here are some known issues. And let's talk about what our position, just as you would when you were covering a strategy.
Mhm.
What's the rationale? Let's go through different scenarios. And I want to be clear, I don't think there's any magic ball here that you're going to be able to predict what are going to be all the issues. But I do think sometimes talking about issues that are known, very helpful when you're dealing with issues that are a surprise, because then you've put an approach and a set of processes together that you can more quickly implement and execute on.
Mhm. Can we look
Yeah,
at the
absolutely.
responses? 1 second, Andrea.
Sure.
Let's just look at the responses from the audience, and then I'd love to have you. Okay, so more than a third of the companies represented do have systems in place, which honestly I think is impressive, given how changing
Yes.
the landscape is. On the other hand, more than half do not. So I'm not particularly surprised by that. There was a recent PwC corporate director survey that found that most boards are not even discussing societal issues yet as a part of their work. So, for those of you that haven't started the process yet, you're not alone on that. On the other hand, I think what you're hearing is that it's time. But Andrea, go ahead and jump in here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we need to reimagine what this means within a company. And again, I come from a government background, political background, so I understand what those public policy folks are saying in the room. And oftentimes it is still narrowly defined as what is the business impact. So tax issues that come up, things like that. They may not be recognizing the full landscape. So for example, Florida, don't say gay. That didn't spring up over 24 hours and all of a sudden employees knew about this. These are things that, my team at Edelman, we track all of these topics. Other companies do this as well. Because yes, while we can't predict everything, there are definitely patterns that you can start to unearth. And again, when you're engaging those stakeholders, you start to sense what they're tracking as well, because those employees are not living in a bubble. They are also living in that community and understanding what is being said. We just released some new data last week that looks at business and racial justice, and to just sort of highlight, yes, to highlight the disconnect that exists right now. We found that 6 in 10 executives say their organization is making meaningful progress on racism in the workplace. So not DEI, racism in the workplace. And fewer than 3 in 10 mid and lower level employees agreed with that. So CEOs, boards, higher management believe things are working, that there is a lot of progress, but the majority of your workforce does not. And so that just speaks to this fact that there needs to be more conversations, and that can be structured. And again, that's that new idea that these issues are here to stay. And so you should really be thinking about this as part of your leadership mandate.
Right. So, sometimes the question is not only, when to speak, but who to speak. So is it the view that you guys have here that it really should be the CEO? Do you think that the CEO should be permitted to speak out without the approval of the board, or do you think the board needs to weigh in? You raised a question earlier, Andrea, about the importance of diverse perspectives, which are not always there in all boards. Can the two of you talk a little bit about your view of, the relationship between the CEO and the board in terms of empowerment here?
Yeah, my view is that as much as possible, the CEO should consult the board before speaking out. And I certainly would do that on a major business issue.
Mm-hmm.
That would be important. And I think I can give you one example because it was public. When the Charlottesville episode happened,
Mm-hmm.
Ken Frazier spoke out.
Mm-hmm.
But he spoke out having discussed what had happened with the board and said, Merck is all about saving people's lives. And this is really an affront to our democracy. And I feel the need to speak out. The board talked about it and unanimously supported him.
Mhm.
And I think at the end of the day, the very fact, and I've said this to people just practically, given the progress, and we still have a ways to go that we have made in bringing about diversity in the workforce,
Mhm.
as
Never
much
mind
as
in the
some
boardroom.
companies may be inclined to say, I don't want to say anything, that's not a tenable position. The reality is, to Andrea's point, there are expectations. Some of them may be too high expectations, but there are expectations that have been created that a diverse workforce is something that people want. And if I look at the Disney situation, again, just from public reports, one of the mistakes that Disney made was they said, at the time, the CEO said, we have decided pretty much all of a sudden that we're not going to speak out on any issue. The reality is that was too late, because Disney had spoken out
Mhm.
on issues and it was a firestorm. And then the CEO had to take a position. And people were saying, well, that's really expedient. And he got hit from both sides. And there will be certain decisions that a company will make, just as they do on business decisions. You can't satisfy everyone, but it goes back to, what do you think is right? How does it align with your strategy? How does it align with your mission goals? But I think, frankly, for a board, one of the fundamental things that I think a board and CEOs have to recognize is diversity is here to stay. It's not going to go away.
Well, and I think you raise a really good point, Ken, because I think one of the reasons that boards and companies can be hesitant about engaging in any of these social issues is the feeling that, to your point, you can't please everyone, that given how polarized the country is, an environment in which literally political differences are a greater divider than race or religion or ethnicity right now. There's kind of a feeling, I think, in some quarters that, not doing anything may be less risky, and doing something may not be able to please everyone. So I guess you talked a little bit, Andrea, about work that you've done and tools that you know about that help companies weigh the risks. Can you talk a little bit more about that for our audience, so they get a sense of kind of what's available in terms of expertise out there that can be helpful here?
Sure, absolutely. Many companies have begun developing frameworks for assessing and weighing different social issues. We, Edelman, have the Societal Issues Navigator. Other companies have created their own as well. But I think it's really important because it touches on exactly the point that Ken was just sharing, which is you can't have an inconsistent approach. People will understand if you decide, there are certain issues, for the most part, that you can't speak out on. But as an example, when the war happened in Ukraine and companies understandably made business decisions and public statements about pulling out of Russia and supporting Ukraine and doing all of that, it was widely heralded in the media. And then what we started to hear and see was, about a week later, clients were scrambling, organizations were scrambling, because employees were saying, well, why didn't you speak out on Syria? Why didn't you speak out in these areas? Why only where it's a business issue for you? All of these questions come up. And, there are ways in which to explain the reasoning. It's not to say that all of a sudden you have to speak out on everything. But going through a framework so that you can have a productive dialogue and really engage the issue rather than a superficial, we're not talking about these types of topics, or the inconsistent approaches that you're seeing, is really, really important to put in that due diligence.
You know, one of the important points, Andrea, that I think is so critical is, and you've been doing this throughout this session, is the importance of giving the different stakeholders context for the situation we're in, the rationale, the basis for different actions. And I will tell you that from a communication standpoint, CEOs don't always do a great job in giving the context and the rationale on societal issues. That is table stakes. You've got to do that. That, I think, is something that's not focused on enough.
Yeah, and I think that point of the why, not just the what, and
Right.
the back to this concept of alignment, because I think that there can be a conflict among stakeholders, just as there can be in the traditional ESG. You know, what's good for climate may not be good for labor in the short term in a location where a company is doing business. And I think that your point about thinking holistically, not just about what the statements are, but what the policies of the company are.
Right.
You know, if you're going to take a position in support of LGBTQ plus rights, but you've been consistently funding elected officials who've taken the contrary position, as you've both said, there's all that is knowable, and that's going to get brought up, and you're going to get called on that. And I think that that's part of the challenge here, is to think about, you know, how to navigate if there are conflicts, and to understand and mitigate, let's say, the risks. So Andrea, when you talk to, you know, clients, you've been on both sides of this because you've been on the public sector side.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, what do you say about how to and how not to respond to pressure campaigns?
I think, again, it's back to really being analytical about these conversations. And it's hard because these are emotional conversations that, you know, people are bringing, particularly when it's issues of identity that are coming to the table. But it's really, really important to understand, again, that risk, the risk on all sides, and, you know, think through whether these campaigns that are being lobbed are really stakeholders or not. So you've seen in recent months a number of organizations flip-flop, which I would argue is one of the worst things you can possibly do, is to come out and take one position and then all of a sudden flip-flop and apologize and take another position and then go back again. And, you know, again, then you just look inauthentic all around as you try to please everyone. You know, activist campaigns, that's red meat, honestly. I mean, that is going to ensure that you are going to see more campaigns in that space. If you are, you know, if you have taken a position on something which presumably you have really thought through and analyzed, and then all of a sudden you're backtracking because of pushback, you know, that can lead to even worse reputational damage in the long term. And so it's really, really important to work with people that understand activist campaigns, and whether or not they're truly having an impact, or if it's just a Twitter storm, so to speak.
So let's take a look at the third question, just to get, again, kind of a benchmark of how people are seeing the environment, because we know that there is this strong stakeholder pressure, particularly from consumers and employees on the one hand, and yet there has been some backlash to some DEI and ESG. So I'm curious for our audience, if you could give us some feedback on what your boards are. And while we take a look at that, you made the point that you know, kind of the flip-flopping is never a particularly good idea. What else, since we all learn from mistakes as much as from what works well, what else have either of you seen that companies have done in these situations that doesn't work?
That's a great question. I think anything that appears like a marketing stunt, honestly. And so, for example, we're coming up on Pride Month. And if your company has not thoughtfully engaged, again, I'm not saying speak out, but thoughtfully engaged the topic around transgender issues in this country right now, which are affecting employees, because we're employees live in your communities. But you rush out and you put a pride flag on your, social media handles, and you talk about pride. You should anticipate you're going to get internal, potentially external backlash, because again, these are real issues that people are thinking about and grappling with, and particularly Gen Z audiences really look closely to see what feels like marketing and just something to make a company feel better in the moment versus a real values-led initiative.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think, Christie, where I've seen the mistake is when people are put in a response mode, reactive mode,
Mm.
and they haven't linked the lack of response or response to what the company stands for and the values of the company. And one of the things when I talk about diversity, one of the terms that I've used with people is we've made a very deliberate and conscious decision that we want to welcome all types of people. Then I go through, let me give you some examples. And this is a core value of the company. And I think, frankly, one of the issues on diversity that I see is that some companies haven't really given context and haven't really explained why it's important. So if it's viewed that diversity is just imposed on you,
Mhm.
then you're going to have a very different way to operate. This is one where there will be increased pressure in some quarters to say, let's slow down in diversity.
Mhm.
I don't think that's going to happen.
Mhm.
And so I think whether it's diversity, whether it's the environment, you've got to talk about some of these issues way before you have to deal with a specific issue.
Well, I think, Ken, because you and I have talked about this, that's a great point vis-a-vis the Disney example, that given the longstanding position they had taken around inclusivity as just
Absolutely.
a core value of the brand, to then seem to walk away from that, A, was a missed opportunity, but B, was just, I don't
Right.
want to say fatal.
And
but
never explain to employees why they changed their position.
Yeah. Let's
And
take a
this
look at the, one second, Andrea. Let's just take a look at the responses to the last question, and then I'll kick it back over to you. Okay. All right, so I find that encouraging. So almost 70% are saying, nope, they're not pulling back. Only 10% are saying they are. And then we still have the percentage of people who are saying, look, right now it's not yet on our board agenda. But I think that is important. And I think maybe, Andrea, I'll let you say exactly what you wanted to, but if you could also, both of you, maybe help the audience think a little bit ahead of what are some of the issues that are coming down the road that are going to be triggered by, extrinsic events that are going to create the need for companies and boards to have thought through in advance how they're going to react.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, what I was going to say is somewhat related to that, so it works out beautifully. Back in that business and racial justice data that we released last week, What we found is more than half of executives misunderstand the term affirmative action, like got the definition completely wrong, which says to me they are definitely not prepared for June. And when that decision comes down, the longer term implications, because it will not just be higher ed that is in this conversation, it will be all of these programs that have been put in place, particularly in the last 3 years, hopefully longer than that, around increasing diversity in the workforce and true inclusion, not just, numbers and things like that. I think the other thing that's really important to understand is that we also found that CEOs and executives are very uncomfortable talking about the issue of race. That was one of our data points as well. And so where I would encourage boards, as they're thinking about these issues and these topics that are coming up, you have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable at this point, because again, the expectation is that you understand these issues and can, think thoughtfully about them and how it may relate to the business needs, both short-term and long-term. Back to abortion, I'm sure that there were very uncomfortable conversations around that issue in many boardrooms. But the reality is what we're hearing many times from companies, and there's data out there on this, is that people are, when they're interviewing for jobs, they're asking questions like, what did you say when this decision came down? What are your DEI policies? And that is factored into their decision-making. So in the race for talent and top, individuals in the workplace, your future workforce, again, it's back to, it is incumbent upon you to understand these issues.
I think that the points that both of you have made about, I'll use the word sort of authenticity, the need to tie the words and the action to that which is demonstrably connected to use words that used at the beginning, Ken, the sort of the mission and values of the company. And I think a really good example, which I've actually heard Roz Brewer speak about, so I'm comfortable sharing it, goes back to when she was head of operations at Starbucks. And she contrasts the campaign that was launched, I think well-intentioned, around discuss race, that was put on the cups as the company's hoped for ability to weigh in on the conversation that makes people uncomfortable, which didn't work at all. People do not want to go to the third place and be forced to have a conversation with their barista or the person in line about race. And so it was just a complete failure. But she contrasts that with when there was that terrible incident in the Starbucks where the African-American customers were arrested for waiting for someone to join them, which went to the heart of being a welcoming brand. And that was so violative of that. And then they closed all the stores to do training and took it very seriously, because then their weighing in was around this value of welcoming that was so core to the brand. So I think that the point that you both have been making about the why and the how, as well as the what, is really, really important for our members and audience to be thoughtful about. Definitely. But I wanted to get the two of you to talk a little bit about issues coming down the road.
Yeah, so I think
you mentioned the affirmative action case. Let's just mention a few others so that the people on the call can be thinking.
I'll give a few issues, which I think is going to be an increasing issue. Is Florida, I think it was 2 weeks ago, I think there's laws pending in probably, I think, 15 to 20 states that would allow basically the government to prescribe or proscribe what's taught at colleges. Now, here's how I think about it, is I think about how to have an educated workforce. And then I also think about the First Amendment and our democracy, that if we are in a situation where higher education is basically prohibited from discussing certain issues, or it's prescribed, that's a pretty fundamental issue. And I think my prediction is it's gonna get very, very hot.
Mhm.
I would advise CEOs and boards really to think about this, really to play out some different scenarios to say, what does that mean for your company? Are you comfortable with that? As you look at the short, moderate, long term for your company, is that something you're comfortable with? And to be careful, because here's where I'd be very careful, is not to get into a partisan issue,
Mhm. Mhm.
is to really say, and this is something that I think companies and boards and CEOs will need to decide, is how will they ground their position? Either they don't take a position at all, or they do take a position, or what do they say to their employees who may say, my gosh, what's happening? Because I don't think, my view is probably in around 6 months, particularly with the presidential election coming up, there's going to be a level of anxiety out there. And so, as I look at different social movements and I separate things from what are some issues that I really think are core
Mhm.
to, again, having a welcoming environment. If I thought colleges were not training students in certain technical areas, would I speak out? I think we would. And so this is one where it's going to be pretty fundamental that, do we accept the principle that education at the college level, I'm not talking about lower than that, at the college level, should be prescribed?
Mhm. Mhm.
And, right now people may say, Ken, that's, that just seems a little bit too broad-based. I will tell you, I think it's going to heat up.
Mhm.
So I'd
And I
start having those conversations at the board level with your CEO, with the board, not saying you got to speak out immediately, but one of the things do you think that's a good idea or not?
Mhm. Andrea?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that issue sensing is spot on, because we do see how if business is the most trusted institution, which is what our data does find, these issues, certainly when there is a business connection and you can clearly make one in terms of workforce development, there will be at least at a minimum, discussions about the role of companies in this conversation, similar to voting. And so when you're talking about what's coming down the pike, what are we looking at? There's some major voting cases before the Supreme Court right now, which will have a fundamental impact on democracy as we know it, and the way in which people have access to voting and those who may not as a result. Similarly, there's an LGBTQ case at the Supreme Court, which directly involves business. It's this idea of whether or not business, it's a freedom of speech versus discrimination. And it's this idea of whether or not businesses can decline to provide services for same-sex couples. The reality is many LGBTQ organizations believe that this is the first of many cases designed to chip away at same-sex marriage, which, as most should know, was only legalized in, short time ago in the grand scheme of things. And so, many companies rely on their HRC ratings and other things as part of their showcasing of workforce development and engagement. And so this idea that, same-sex marriage could ultimately be re-examined, that is something that companies need to be prepared for. It certainly was a hot discussion coming out of Dobbs. So there's a number of issues. And then, of course, the anti-ESG campaigns that are all over the place right now, and certainly which are creating shareholder pressure as well. So there are a number of things, and as Ken said, it's only going to heat up as we enter a more prevalent presidential cycle.
Let's take a look at what our audience thinks about issues as they're considering what's coming down the pike. Can we put up the fourth question? Okay. So while you all can vote on these, I want to kind of shift a little bit. So suppose, I'm on the board of a company and my attitude is, well, it's not a consumer brand. It's not a Fortune 50. We're even domiciled in a state that's kind of a centrist state. It's not Florida or California. I don't think we have to really think about these issues the way the Disneys or the Anheuser-Busch's have to. What would you say to someone who posits that?
I think the reality is you have an employee base, and you have clients and customers, and you won't escape it. I absolutely agree. Consumer brands are more impacted, but the reality is every company, there are few companies I know who would disavow having a diverse workforce, say, I don't want that. I only want one type of population. And for American Express, we operated all around the world. And as you know, Christie, one of the things I was very clear about is here are the core values of the company. And what we're not going to do is adjust our core values to each market that we operate in. Now, very frankly, some companies did that.
Right.
I just think that's a mistake in the world we live in now. And I think it's a real problem with employee. And so I think to Andrea's point is we look at the demographics, we look at people coming into the workforce, there's a level of expectation. And I just don't think you can stick your head in the sand on this one.
Andrea?
Yeah, I mean, I would say you don't know what you don't know. And so, and you can't make that assumption until you have gauged your stakeholders. And so that's where a process and a consistent process is really, really important, whether that's, surveys, which a number of companies do, or town halls or open office hours or things like that. But I've been in too many rooms where boards and CEOs make those offhand comments, and I can tell you oftentimes they don't reflect me in terms of my gender, and certainly don't reflect a number of race, age, and other demographics as well. And so the reality is we all come in with bias, we all come in with our own human experience, and these are emotional issues, and until you can really do that due diligence, it's really impossible to just have that knee-jerk assumption.
Yeah, the other thing I would say, Christie, is putting aside for a second any social issue, it's important, I think, for management at different levels to do town halls with their employees, to talk to them.
Agree.
And one of the things that we did is employees could ask us any question they wanted. Didn't mean we answered every single question, but I know with my successor, Steve Squeri, he was asked the question, how do you feel about what happened January 6th? Steve could have elected to say, that's political, I want to talk about it. Steve said, I was horrified. I think that's absolutely wrong. And those are not only my personal beliefs, but look at what our company stands for. That's a fundamental problem. Now, the reality is probably 50% of our employees or close to it voted for Trump. But the reality is what employees understood were the values of American Express were critical. They may disagree with each other politically, But the reality is grounding it in those values is important. I was asked at a town hall, how do you feel about what the president has said here when in fact it was clear it was a lie? And I said, you know what I stand for. I stand for integrity. I stand for consistency of words and actions. I don't care who it is. Anyone who lies, I have a problem with. Now, again, I didn't comment on a policy. People in the company, and I consistently took this position, I did not tell anyone who I voted for. And we had a policy we didn't support. We could not publicly contribute to anyone running for president.
Well, I can attest to that because I went to see you in 2008.
Absolutely.
To ask if you would join me in supporting Barack Obama, because you and I have known each other a lot of years.
Absolutely.
And you said to me, that's not something I can do publicly. You know, the board has set guidelines. You know, I respected that. And I think we enlisted your wife at one point, but
you did. But I think what's really important there, Christie, that gets to, there are some areas where the board can give the CEO air cover. And I think the American Express board was incredibly thoughtful. And one of the reasons why they took that position, I won't say who, but one of my predecessors went out very early for someone running for president. And it caused issues. And they just said, look, from this point on, the CEO cannot publicly support anyone running for president. I'm not advising that for every company, but I think what you want to think about, it gave me a level of credibility inside the company so that when we did speak out, people did not think I was taking a partisan position.
Right. No, I think that's true. Let's take a look at the response to the last question. All right. So I would say, first of all, like virtually nobody said none of the above. So I think it's a very attuned audience in terms of recognizing that these are issues to be concerned about, with none gaining fewer than half of the votes, and, you know, climate up at over 80%, affirmative action at 3/4. So I think that certainly suggests that the boards that are represented on this call are fully cognizant of the fact that regardless of your geography or your industry or whatever, that this dynamic that we're discussing is really going to impact everybody around these issues as they impact the companies. So I think that's actually very good to hear. We talked a little bit about Florida. What do you feel, and maybe Andrea, I'll start with you on this. What's a company to do when states are passing laws that are completely contradictory? You know, so you've got, you know, one state passing a law that, you know, they're characterizing as anti-woke in terms of what can't be done, and another state passing a law that's sort of mandating a kind of inclusivity. And we can certainly think about this in the context of climate and others. What do you say to your clients when they're saying, you know, throwing up their hands and saying, you know, now what am I supposed to do?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to exactly what Ken has been talking about, which is first you got to understand what your values are as a company, and what are the policies you have supported and you're, you know, in this space to begin with. And so if you don't have that fundamental understanding, it's going to be really hard to think through any sort of positioning. But I think companies overall are acquiescing a lot of power for unnecessary reasons. At the end of the day, you are an economic driver in these states. And as somebody who's worked for a politician before, I can tell you that, you know, politicians do listen to business leaders quite closely. And, you know, I'm not saying you go out and you hold a press conference, but, you know, there is power in coalition in particular among business leaders. And there is, you know, a recognition that you have a seat at the table for a lot of these conversations. So if there are policies that you believe are harmful to your company in the terms of the long-term growth and stability of the company, to your employee bases, you should be thinking through how you're going to communicate your concerns to, any of the folks that are making those decisions, and not assume that, the first decision and the first public statement made by a politician becomes the final decision as well.
So since you
Absolutely.
mentioned politicians, there's a interesting question in the chat that I'd like to read and get both of your thoughts on. So this is from Alan Levinson. Many companies have PACs who donate to officials in states where they do business. They're not politically focused, and thus they donate to people of both parties because they're related to, their direct business interests. However, should companies whose values include being inclusive and equitable donate to politicians who do not share their views on inclusivity and equity?
I think it's a slippery slope, in the sense that just as on business issues, there is donations that are made, and you may not agree with all the actions taken and the impact it has on your company and the business of your company. But I do think there are some fundamental issues. So I know that some companies after January 6th did withdraw because they said that's such a fundamental affront to our democracy, that we can't support that. So I think what my view is, Alan, that I think we have to be careful to go through every single issue and do a litmus test. But I do think there are some fundamental issues. So I'll just give you my bias. If in fact 20 states pass laws saying we're going to prescribe what can be taught in colleges and universities, that just goes against our democracy. I think that becomes a real problem. And so I think you got to monitor, but I don't think that you can focus on every issue as a litmus test.
Andrea?
Because look, at the end of the day,
sorry.
as divided as our political parties are now, democracy is about compromise.
Yeah, I mean, I get this question posed all the time. And I think, one, you should know where you're giving and where you have given. And you'd be surprised how many companies have been caught off guard that way. And reporters can easily find this information. I would make sure that you have clear reasons for why you have donated there as well. And, certainly don't engage in one-sided giving if in fact you are a nonpartisan or company or bipartisan in approach. And then, the other thing that I would just remind companies is these are evolving, fluid conversations at all times, and you need to be able to create a criteria for when you would stop a donation or when you would not engage anymore. Because again, January 6th, I think that was a, obviously massive scale event. And you certainly don't want to be debating having that discussion for hours afterwards. You would hope that there would be some clear guidance there. But some of these other issues are not so clear cut. And so it's really important, again, thinking through your mission and values to understand what is the line that you would draw.
Yeah, and one other thing, Andrea, I think you somewhat made this point is to use, in fact, the opportunity and the access that CEOs and other members of management of a company have to, in fact, make it clear to that particular elected official what concerns you have about the votes that they've taken, because of how it affects your employees. So I do think you've got to be more sophisticated. It's not just that you're making statements, but you're also using your access to say, look, I just have to tell you, here are the problems with this. These are the problems you're causing for me with my employees, just as you would on a business issue. because it is a business issue.
So you'd referenced coalitions earlier, Andrea, and so I'm just interested in what the two of you think boards should be thinking about when they think, on the one hand, that there is an issue that should be addressed, that it does tie to kind of an alignment of what the values and mission of the company is, but they're trying to weigh the how. And so, they're debating, should our CEO say something directly on the voting rights issue, for example, Ken, that you talked about earlier.
Right.
You and Ken Frazier together went out and then built the coalition. Should we look to build a coalition? Should we work through our trade association? How do we navigate?
I would say it's a
part?
combination. I think sometimes it's the trade association. Sometimes I think it's very appropriate for a board to say, sometimes I don't want to be the first person out. Let's see what other companies are doing. And that was critical to the voting rights, is we got some companies that we knew were big influencers, and some boards were saying, let's see what's going to happen. Then they saw the momentum and they said, okay, we now can manage the risk from our standpoint.
Mhm.
And I would say there are certain issues where there's nothing wrong with that. But what you want to make sure is you're calibrating the risk that you're taking, and you're calibrating that against the credibility of your leader with different stakeholders.
Mhm. And that process of identifying the position of different stakeholders and then the calibration of the risk, that's a process that you're both saying, and certainly I would agree with, should be done in advance, not in the moment of crisis, and should be done by the CEO and leadership and then brought to and engaged with. Now I'm going to ask the question, is it the full board? Is it the nom-gov committee? Is it a risk committee? At the board level, how do each of you think about that?
From my side, it all depends how boards operate. Some boards are very reliant in a very constructive way on committees, and then they take it up with the full board. Sometimes I think it's very appropriate that individual board members are called. Sometimes I would call each board member individually so that I could give them an opportunity to talk, and also so we could have a one-on-one conversation. But then, in fact, I would share with the board, with the full board, here's what I heard, and then open it up to the board. And one of the things I would just say, as Andrea said, for example, in race, CEOs aren't comfortable and boards aren't comfortable. Part of what I think is important is, and what I think we're all saying is, you need to have some of those uncomfortable conversations now. And you may not know what the specific issue is coming down the pike, but I will tell you, having that conversation, and those conversations will be incredibly helpful when you are surprised by an issue that you're not prepared for, but you've had some of those uncomfortable conversations in a range of areas. And I will tell you, I think sometimes boards are too passive aggressive. And, you can be polite, but, part of what I wanted from my board is I called it constructive confrontation. Let's really get the issues out. Let's talk about it. Let's do it respectfully. Let's make sure people listen. But I think these are issues where you need constructive confrontation.
I would not only say I agree with that, Ken, but I would even make the case that learning how to use those muscles, learning how to create that dynamic in a boardroom is going to really hold that board in good stead for all kinds of other complicated, controversial conversations that aren't even around societal issues.
Absolutely agree.
That are around what we might call the, more traditional business issues, because that passive aggressiveness, as you characterized it, as compared with, as you characterized it, constructive confrontation. That's a really critical skill for a board to have to function at the highest level.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and
So, oh, go ahead, Andrea.
I was just going to add to that, that is something I saw quite frequently in the wake of Dobbs, where, and sometimes it was that the CEO had not elevated the conversation to the board. Other times the board had been in the conversation, everybody had decided we're going to stay quiet, we're going to wait. And then the decision came down, and all of a sudden I saw a number of times boards would turn around and say, why didn't we say anything? All of these other companies have said something. And so again, back to that point of this is all part of your due diligence. You've got to bake these conversations in at your board meetings. This has to become muscle memory on societal issues because they're here to stay. And while some things are unknowable, there's certainly enough here that as we've raised that you would have a full agenda to partake in.
So I'm sad, but not surprised to say that the time has flown by and we are approaching our completion time before the bonus round. So let me just end by asking each of you, maybe Ken, we'll start with you, just to share kind of the takeaway, lessons that you would want our audience to, when they go back to their boards, to really be focused on and to bring into those boardrooms.
I think the takeaway is that the role of companies continues to evolve. And that's just a reality. So there's been a lot of conversation on social issues, but I think it's very difficult for a company to divorce themselves from what's happening in the world. That just doesn't work anymore. And I think understanding what the core values are of the company and what the commitments are of the company, because commitments change. And you need to understand what your core commitments are from a business standpoint, from a social standpoint, and you've got to understand what your values and principles are. And then the last point, as I said, is this is a journey where there needs to be a high level of trust between the CEO and the board, and engage in constructive confrontation, use those muscles that Christie talked about. And I think you'll find it'll be beneficial across the board.
Terrific. Andrea?
I would just add to that because I agree wholeheartedly with everything that was just said, but companies need to recognize that they shouldn't be waiting for these issues to break. Because when they do come down, they often come down quickly and very hard and have a steamroll effect. So again, that proactive planning is really, really critical. I think the other thing that we sort of touched on, but didn't say quite as much on, silence is also a statement in some of these settings. And so you should be prepared that that is how it will be read as well by your stakeholders. And whether or not you feel comfortable with that statement is really, really important, because I think people think that there is just this complete, again, binary choice of we say something or we don't say anything at all. And as I think we touched on, there's a whole range of ways in which you can engage a topic. So I hope that people do really think through these items and talk to their boards, because it's the future of business.
Yeah, and I would just say, one is it's been a delight, Andrea, to be on this panel with you. And Christie, you did, as always, an absolutely superb job. But the last thing I would just say to everyone is I'm hopeful. I think this is a super exciting time to be in business, and don't run away from change. Embrace it. That's what you want to make sure, that you're embracing that change. And we're clearly aware of the challenges. But I think this is a really exciting time, in my view, to be in business. I'm going to have to run.
I agree.
I'll leave you.
And you
Thank
beat
you.
me by thanking me, because I just wanted to thank you. I know you changed your schedule to be able to be here with us, and it means a lot to me, and I know to all of the participants. You
Thank you.
run. Andrew
Take
will
care.
stay for the bonus round.
Bye,
Take care.
everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
So let me make sure that I'm paying attention to the chat, because those of you that are able to stay for this last 15 minutes have an extraordinary opportunity here to engage with Andrea, who also was very gracious in adjusting her schedule to be able to be with us today. And you don't usually get this kind of access. So I want to make sure we're getting a lot of kudos in the chat.
The pressure's on.
Very nice. So I want to see, though, if there are any particular questions. A lot of very nice comments, which is wonderful to see. Going back a bit, and I'm not sure that that was the feedback, but somebody did ask about why voting rights is not relatively important, given this is a subject which is basic to our democracy as a country, which I think was a reading of the fact that it wasn't as high as some of the other issues. Climate, I believe, was the one that came out on top, but
Yeah.
I think voting rights was fairly significant too. My own view on that, and Andrea should speak to it, is that I think, especially if you're comparing or benchmarking against climate, that climate probably has had the longest runway of time where companies have understood the need to focus on it. It's so central to ESG. You know, it's been so much talked about as the classic example of it really is about evaluating and mitigating risk. It really is a business imperative. So I tend to think it's that. But there is a question which we didn't get to, and I think it'd be great, Andrea, for you too, which is to talk about the recent situation in terms of Anheuser and Bud Light, which certainly seemed to fall in the category of, well, there's a good case study for actually irritating everybody.
Yes, and I should be clear, I have not worked on that, with that company on this, so so I'm not privy to any of the inside
Well, that makes it
conversations.
easier. So you
Yes.
can share your opinions without
Yes.
violating any trust.
Yes, I think there are a couple of lessons to take away from that situation, and certainly Budweiser isn't the only company that has been targeted at this point. There have been other companies in the wake of that campaign that have been targeted as well. I think again, this is where it's really, really important for every part of the house to know what is happening and to understand the issues landscape. There is no way that I think you could reasonably say you had no idea that trans issues were hot button issues in US society. It was a major plank of the CPAC conversation for the GOP. It was part of the rebuttal to the State of the Union. And certainly we have seen laws passed all around this country, which LGBTQ groups have been raising alarms about. So firstly, it's sort of understanding the space that you are operating in. Secondly, it's again about understanding your audiences, and really sort of recognizing the values of your company. Now, from all indications, it seems as if there was a decision that had been made to really focus on being more inclusive in that space. And so maybe
and broadening their audience. I mean, it
Correct.
really started with a business marketing objective.
Correct. So it might have been the right business objective. The question is, was it the right audience? And was it the right time as well? Back to that concept that we had talked about in terms of feeling inauthentic. This was, a March Madness campaign. There's just lots of questions. And again, I was not part of that room, but I think there are a number of certainly learnings from that situation. The final piece I would say is, let's not learn the wrong lessons though as well. And I saw this a lot after Don't Say Gay, where there was a real rush, particularly in certain media publications, a lot of op-eds that were saying, this is why we shouldn't be engaging in these issues. And candidly, for another company, this may be an incredible opportunity for them to assert their values and their brand. And so I don't think you should read into this situation and say, a blanket, well, therefore we're going to face the same opposition, because I can tell you a lot of opposition actually sometimes helps you, really sort of curry favor with your own audiences as well.
Well, I think that Nike certainly would be an example of that with the Colin Kaepernick. I mean, they made a very conscious decision that not only sticking with him, but making him front and center, a spokesperson of the brand, was very much designed with an eye towards there will be people who will walk away from us for this, but for the more important constituents in terms of how we see our market, this is in our interest. So that gets me to a really interesting question that Eric Kurzweil has just raised that I'll jump in here with. He writes, should the overarching litmus test when taking a position or planning a message be to answer the question, what would benefit the long-term success of the organization? And then follow that by a risk assessment of approaches?
I mean, I think it's one of the questions that you absolutely should be asking yourself. One of the things that we do is we ask a number of questions around how closely does the topic align with the company's purpose, vision, and overall strategy. And so you have to have an understanding of what your long-term strategy goals are. And it may be that you are willing to take some criticism initially, because candidly, you can't release anything these days without some criticism. So, it's just, again, your risk tolerance and where you see your future state. But those are the types of questions that you should absolutely be asking when you are looking at a topic and thinking through what you want to do about it.
There's another question about a specific, Andrea, which you may or may not feel comfortable commenting on, but Sharda asks about any insights or context that you might have on the recent Uber CDO situation, any learnings from that?
Yeah, I don't have any on that one. But certainly, I think, again, the beauty of all of this right now is we're all sort of learning through this process, right? There's really no company that can say that they have done it perfectly. And, audiences are, just as views change on these topics over time, audiences change on these times. So again, I think the beauty of right now is that we have a lot of academic material to look at and make our own evaluations.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about the dynamic. And I think that's my view is that would be true for employees on even a broader range of perspectives than just societal issues. So, understanding through, we were talking about town halls earlier. I actually used to do them and let people write their questions anonymously. And I'm not a fan of anonymity in that sense. I'm a fan of transparency. But what I came to realize is if the goal was to air what people were actually thinking or concerned about, so that I could address it, then the reality is that people would be more forthcoming if they didn't have to stand up and ask the question. And so I think that just having your ear to the ground, so to speak, especially with regard to the employee stakeholder group, as well as the consumer stakeholder group, those are just skills and behaviors that are essential to business right now, that then, to your point, Andrea, will hold you in good stead in this dynamic of issues around, societal issues. So,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do think those surveys, even when they are anonymous, it's really important to have that pulse check on these topics, because people do surprise you what they see as relevant and the connections that they make specifically to your organization.
So, in kind of a follow-up to the question about long-term objectives of an organization as what you're benchmarking against, Joanne Barry raises an interesting question, which is, are the time horizons for businesses and politicians misaligned on these issues, with politicians looking to the next election and CEOs looking out decades? It's difficult to take the politicians seriously because of the disconnect. So you've been on both sides. Andrea, what would you say about that?
I mean, as soon as you win the election, the next day you're thinking about the next election. So yes, there is a short-term horizon for sure. It's a great point, and one that candidly I hadn't thought of in terms of some of the misalignments. So thank you so much. What I would say is our Edelman Trust Barometer research shows that business, but in particular my employer, is the most trusted institution right now. And we have found that business is seen as both competent and ethical. And so with that comes a great amount of responsibility. And so, you know, you will never find politicians ranking as high in the trust barometer, and certainly, you know, not government as well. So, you know, take with that, you have a great degree of responsibility, and recognize that as you're doing your decision making.
I think that's a perfect note on which to end this conversation. And I want to again thank Andrea and Ken for just the deep engagement and thoughtful counsel that you've provided for our audience. I want to thank Joan Steele and NACD's staff for making this such a easy meeting to be participating in. And I want to thank all of you who took time out of your busy schedules to engage around this really important topic. I think the very fact that you chose to be with us today tells me that, as Ken said, there's lots of reason to be optimistic. So Joan, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, thank you so much. And this was a fantastic program. As we saw in the chat box, our members found this to be very valuable. So please join me in thanking Christie, Andrea, and Ken for the masterclass and invaluable takeaways we can now share with our boards. Andrea, and again, Ken, we certainly appreciate your considerable experience and thoughtful advice, and Christie, for your leadership in expertly navigating this complex subject and very important discussion. Following today's program, you will receive an email with links to the Edelman and the NACD resources referenced today. We also ask that you please complete a brief survey on today's program that is posted in the chat box. Your input is valued and influences our programming. Lastly, a thank you to all our sponsors whose support makes programs like these possible, and to our very capable and hardworking staff, Kathy Hendrickson, Kathleen Clevenger, and to all of you for attending. This concludes today's program. Our meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Christie. Yes.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Thanks, Kathy.
That was a good program. All right, we'll chat later.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, sounds great. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.